The morning she first told him he was wrong about the drainage, he had been pretending to be someone else for 11 days. He stood at the edge of the lower field in the clothes of a working man, a plain brown coat and boots plain enough to pass among the laborers he was supposed to be directing, and he was watching her cross the yard behind the dower house with a basket of cloth strips and a proprietary air that suggested she owned everything she looked at, whether or not the deed said otherwise. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the ground, at the seam where the field met the clay path, and her expression was not polite. He noted that, the way one notes a detail in a ledger that does not balance. The women who came to tend the estate's sick were, in his experience, deferential in the presence of any man with authority over the land, and he had been made to understand, from the moment he arrived under the borrowed name of Mr. Hale, that Miss Cecily Fenn was not worth noting. The housekeeper had said it plainly. An adequate nurse, Miss Fenn. Sensible enough for the country. Not from anywhere of consequence. Cecily Fenn set her basket on the fence post, looked at the trench he had directed the men to cut 2 days prior, and said, to no one in particular, and therefore to him, that it would flood before the month turned. He asked her, from a distance of 6 feet, what she knew about field drainage. She looked up then, directly, without apology. She had gray eyes, the color of the sky above the Shropshire hills on an overcast afternoon, and they carried in them no particular deference to the brown coat or the borrowed name. She said that she had grown up on a farm, that she had watched drainage cut wrong twice in her life, and flood twice on exactly the schedule the wrong cut promised, and that if he moved the outlet 15 feet east and followed the natural slope of the field, rather than imposing a line on it, the water would go where water wished to go, without argument. She picked up her basket. She walked to the dower house without looking back. He stood in the mud for another moment, looking at the trench, and then he went to find the head laborer and told him to redirect the work. He did not tell Miss Fenn she had been right. He was not yet sure what to make of a woman who corrected him without first having been asked. The estate of Thornhaven had been in his family for 4 generations, which meant it had also, for 4 generations, been imperfectly known. His father had managed it by post from London, his grandfather by occasional visits, and Gideon himself, who had inherited the Marquessate of Ashvalle at the age of 26, when a riding accident removed his father from the living, had managed it for 6 years by the reports of a succession of stewards whose descriptions of the land did not always match the land itself. He had come in disguise not out of contempt for his tenants or his staff, but out of a desire to see clearly, which he had learned he could not do when people knew who he was. When they knew who he was, they told him what they believed he wished to hear. The housekeeper smiled too much. The head farmer spoke too carefully. Everyone moved slightly to the side, as though preparing for the fact of him, and the estate he saw was not the estate that existed, but a version of it cleaned and dressed for his inspection. He had wanted the real thing. He had taken the name Hale, and the brown coat, and the ordinary boots, and he had walked the land for 11 days in the rain, and the rare pale sunshine, and the mud of the lower fields, and he had seen more clearly in 11 days than in 6 years of correspondence. He had not anticipated Miss Fenn. The sick in the estate's cottages were, in the autumn of 1814, more numerous than usual. A summer of close weather had produced a fever that moved from family to family through the shared well at the north end of the lane, and the nearest physician was at Cresswell, 8 miles east, and came twice a month with the look of a man who considered the journey a charity. In his absence, the nurse managed. Cecily Fenn managed with the spare authority of a woman who has watched too many people suffer from things that could have been prevented, and the particular quality of her efficiency was that it made no allowances for the feelings of those who were not ill. If you stood in her way, she moved around you. If you gave her a wrong instruction, she corrected it. If you gave her a foolish instruction, she did not say it was foolish. She simply did not follow it. And when asked afterward, she explained what she had done instead and why, with a clarity that left very little room for argument. He observed this over the course of the second week. He observed it in the way she managed the Hatch family's fever. 4 children and a mother whose husband had been dead since February. Keeping each one separated in the small house in a way that was not the doctor's instruction, but was plainly sensible and plainly hers. He observed it when she spoke to the man from the north end of the lane who wanted to know why she had told the Perrow family to stop using the shared well, and she told him, with a patience that was not quite patience, that the well was the source and that his family would prefer temporary inconvenience to permanent loss. He observed it when she came to the field a second time, 4 days after the drainage matter, and told him without preamble that the Hatch mother was recovering, but would need wood for the fire, and that the existing store would not last the week. He said he was not the man she ought to address about the wood store. She said she was addressing the man who had given the directions to the laborers, and who therefore had the practical authority to redirect them for a morning, and that if she was wrong about who he was, she would be grateful for a correction. He told her the wood would be arranged. She said thank you, in a tone that was merely civil, and left. He was unused to being thanked merely civilly. He was, in his real life, thanked effusively, thanked with an anxiety that wanted something from the thanks, thanked in a way that reminded him constantly that the gratitude was owed to his rank rather than to anything he had done. Miss Fenn's thank you was addressed to a man who had agreed to a reasonable request. It landed differently. He noticed it landing differently and was not sure what to do with the noticing. He arranged the wood. He said nothing about it when he saw her next, 2 days later, crossing from the Dower house to the lane. She did not mention it either. This also struck him as distinct from what he was accustomed to. What she did not know, in those early weeks, was that her name had reached London before she reached Thornhaven. She had been hired on the recommendation of his cousin, Lady Alderton, who had said in the letter that announced the engagement of her services that Miss Fenn was a good nurse and a sensible woman and would not require managing, which in Lady Alderton's vocabulary meant she was capable of making judgments without instruction and could be trusted to do so. He had not thought about Miss Fenn before arriving. She had been a name in a letter, a function in the estate's household. He had formed no picture of her. The woman who told him he was wrong about the drainage was not reducible to a function. He began to find reasons to be near the Dower House yard. This was not, he told himself, anything other than professional interest. The sick in the cottages were a concern of the estate. The nurse's management of them was a concern of the estate. It was reasonable to observe the management. It was reasonable to stand at a gate in the morning and watch a woman check the temperature of a child's forehead with the back of her wrist and speak to the child's mother in a voice too quiet to carry to the gate. He knew this reasoning was insufficient. He continued to stand at the gate. The third week brought a cold, dry spell and a visitor from Cresswell. If something moved in him when he saw the man, he did not examine it closely. What he saw was a physician, who arrived on a good horse, was shown immediately to Miss Fenn, and stood in the yard of the Dower House, speaking with her for 20 minutes, with the physician smiling, and Miss Fenn smiling back, which was a thing Gideon had not yet seen, and the physician's hand resting briefly on her arm near the elbow, which was a thing he found he did not wish to see repeated. This response was inconvenient. He was a Marquess in a brown coat, who was not supposed to be a Marquess. He had no standing to resent the hand on the arm. He had no standing for any of it. He went back to the fields. He told himself, walking the east boundary in the thin autumn light, that the visit of the physician was irrelevant. He told himself that whatever he had begun to feel, standing at the gate, was a consequence of the disguise, the strange compressed world of the brown coat and the borrowed name, in which a woman who corrected him without apology was noteworthy because everyone else corrected nothing. He was not entirely persuaded by his own argument. He had been Gideon Ashvale, Marquess of Ashvale, since the age of 26, formed by its expectations and responsibilities before that. He had been engaged once, at 22, to a woman chosen by his father and his father's solicitor with the thoroughness of a business transaction, and the engagement had dissolved when the woman chose another man quickly and without apparent distress, which had told him something he had understood but not quite named, that she had never seen him as a man. She had seen the title. She had calculated the title. When a better calculation presented itself, she had moved to it. Since then, he had maintained a careful distance from the machinery of the marriage market. He had come to believe, with a quiet grief he did not discuss with anyone, that the title was the primary thing anyone would ever see, and that the man inside it was of secondary interest at best. Miss Cecily Fenn did not know he was the Marquess of Ashvale. She spoke to him as Mr. Hale. She corrected Mr. Hale's assessment of the drainage. She asked Mr. Hale to arrange the wood. She thanked Mr. Hale in a tone that was merely civil, and when she brought her next concern to him, 4 days into the cold spell, it was about the north well and the pipe that fed it, and the fact that the pipe had shown signs of cracking that would worsen in a hard frost, and she told him this in the same practical voice she used for everything, looking at him with those gray eyes that registered him as a working man with practical authority, and nothing more. He listened. He asked questions, because the questions were genuine. She answered them without simplifying, which was a thing she had apparently worked out about him, that he could follow an argument about pipe joints and ground frost and the consequence of a failed water source in a community of sick people. When she finished, he said he would look at the pipe himself that afternoon. She said she would show him where it ran, if he did not already know the route. He did not already know the route. He had not known, from London, from his correspondence, from his succession of inadequate stewards, that the North Well had a pipe at all. She walked with him along the lane. She pointed with one gloved hand to the place where the ground gave slightly above the pipe's path, and she said that the gyve was new, that the ground had been firm in October, and that a hard frost would press through the frost line and do what water in a confined space does when it turns. He knelt and pressed the ground and understood what she meant and felt, looking at the soft place in the earth. A specific sharp gratitude, the kind that arrives when you understand that someone has prevented a harm before you knew the harm was there. He said quietly that she was observant. She said she was a nurse, and that she had learned to look for what had not yet gone wrong. He looked up at her. She was looking at the ground still, at the soft place, at the thing that needed attention. The afternoon light was pale and direct and fell across her face without flattery, and what it showed was a woman somewhere near 26, with a composed face that held its feelings below the visible surface, and hands that bore the marks of constant work and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a great deal of time in rooms where noise is harmful. He had not, in 11 years of the title, been attended to in that way. Looked for before you went wrong. Tended before the harm was visible. The title attracted observation. Yes, constant observation. But it was the kind that catalogued what was present, not the kind that checked for what was missing. He rose from the ground. He told her he would have men at the pipe by morning. She said thank you, in that same merely civil voice, and turned back toward the dower house. He stood in the lane and watched her go and understood. arriving at the understanding without particular welcome that he was in considerable difficulty. The fourth week brought the physician again, and a letter from London. The letter was from his aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Ashvale, who had been managing the family's London affairs in his absence with an efficiency he generally admired and occasionally found constraining. The letter informed him that Lady Harrogate had inquired, through Lady Harrogate's mother, whether the Marquess of Ashvale had formed any intentions toward Lady Harrogate's eldest daughter, a young woman of good family, excellent connections, and a manner the Dowager described as distinguished, which was the word she used for women whose manners were so controlled as to carry no warmth. The letter also informed him that the Dowager had indicated, in response, that the Marquess of Ashvale was at present in the country, but would be returning to London for the winter season, at which time the matter could be addressed properly. He sat with the letter in the single spare room the Dower House had made available to the new land steward, and he looked at the fire, and he thought about the woman with the distinguished manner, whom he had met twice at 2 events in the spring season, and who had addressed him with the precise mixture of deference and animation that had been calculated. He understood, for exactly the impression it made. He thought about the gray eyes. He thought about the phrase the housekeeper had used. Not from anywhere of consequence. In the morning, he went to the Dower House yard, and Miss Fenn was there, speaking to the physician, and the physician had his hand on her arm again, near the elbow. And this time the physician was speaking quietly, and she was looking at the ground with an expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite its absence. The expression of someone receiving information they are deciding how to receive. He stopped at the gate. The physician left. Miss Fenn turned toward the house and saw him at the gate, and her expression returned to its working composition, which was a kind of careful attention that did not carry warmth toward him specifically, only the general attention she brought to any problem of the estate. He asked about the Hatch children. She told him they were better. He asked about the pipe. She said the men had been, and it had been addressed. He asked how she had come to be at Thornhaven, which he had not asked before, because it was not a question a land steward would ordinarily ask a nurse who had been hired before the steward's own arrival. She looked at him for a moment. The gray eyes measured something. She said that Lady Alderton had written to her in September and asked if she would consider the post, that she had been nursing in York for 3 years before that, and in her home county of Derbyshire before York, and that she had considered Thornhaven's situation and found it a reasonable engagement. He asked if she intended to remain. She said that depended on the estate's needs and whether the position remained useful. He asked if it depended on anything else. She looked at him again. The measuring quality was more explicit now. Not quite a challenge, but not quite the mere professional assessment she had offered in earlier weeks. She said that was a personal question, Mr. Hale, and that she did not know him well enough to answer personal questions. He said carefully that she was right, and that he had overstepped. He apologized. She looked at him for a moment longer, as though the apology required the same assessment she brought to everything else, and then she nodded and went inside. He wrote to London that evening and told his aunt that the matter of Lady Harrogate's daughter should not be further encouraged. The Dowager's response arrived 4 days later and contained the information that she had already accepted an invitation to Lady Harrogate's dinner on his behalf, which she had done in full confidence that he would see reason, and that the dinner was in 3 weeks, and that he was expected to be in London by the 2nd week of November. He held the letter and looked at the fire and felt the specific grinding sensation of the title reasserting its own requirements. The social machinery that moved regardless of the man inside it, that had obligations and calendars and strategically timed dinners that were not asked to wait for anything so inconsequential as what he had begun to feel in a dour house yard in Shropshire. He had perhaps 3 weeks left at Thornhaven. He was not sure what he wanted to do with them. What he did was work. He walked every boundary of the estate he had not yet walked. He sat with the head farmer for 2 mornings and went through the real accounts, the ones that showed which fields had been underseeded and which drainage had failed before the new trench and which tenant roofs had been waiting for repair since his father's time. He wrote new instructions and sent them himself. He made himself useful in the way that the brown coat demanded, which was quietly and without the expectation of acknowledgement. He also, because he could not help it, continued to find reasons to be near the Dower House yard. On a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, he found her sitting on the low wall at the edge of the yard with a letter in her hands, not reading it, but holding it closed, looking at the hills beyond the field with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not her working expression. It was something quieter and more tired, the expression of someone who has been careful for a very long time and is, in this one unobserved moment, not being careful. He understood that he was observing what she had not shown anyone. He was about to withdraw when she turned and saw him. She did not startle. She folded the letter with a precise, practiced motion, and her face returned to its composed arrangement, but not immediately, and in the half-second before it did, he saw the tiredness plainly. He said he had not meant to intrude. She said he had not intruded. He asked if there was anything that required attention. She said there was not. He stood at the yard's edge and did not leave, which was a departure from every practical thing he might have said to justify remaining. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And then she said, with a candor that told him she had made a decision about the risk of candor, that she had had a letter from her sister, who lived in York, and that her sister had been unwell through the autumn and was no longer improving, and that she did not know what she ought to do about it. He said he was sorry about her sister. She said she was 28 miles from a coaching route, which was Thornhaven's particular difficulty, that the estate was beautiful and genuinely needed, and the work was real, and none of that resolved the distance. He asked how she had come to be a nurse. She looked at him as though this question were a new development in their acquaintance, which it was. She said that she had been the second of 4 children on a small farm, that her father had been a capable man and a loving father, and not a careful manager, and that by the time she was 22 the farm was gone, and her father was dead, and her mother and younger sisters needed to eat, and that nursing was work she could do well and be paid for, and that paid sufficiently. He said she spoke of it without self-pity. She said self-pity was a luxury the second child of a failed farm could not afford. He asked if she had always been so direct. She said she had been told, more than once, that it was a fault. He said, carefully, that he did not think it was a fault. She looked at him with the measuring quality, the same one she had turned on him when he asked personal questions. But this time, it was not a boundary being drawn. It was something else. Something she was deciding about. She said that he was not like most land stewards. He said that was likely true. She said she did not mean it as a complaint. He looked at the folded letter in her hands. He looked at the hills behind her, the same hills she had been watching when she thought no one was watching her. And he felt the weight of what he had not said to her, the weight of the name he had not used, the rank he had hidden in a brown coat for the purpose of seeing clearly. And he understood that seeing clearly had produced a consequence he had not anticipated. He told her he would find a way to facilitate a visit to York, if she wished it, through the estate's provisions for necessary travel. She looked at him for a long moment. She said that was not a thing a land steward could authorize. He said that he believed he could arrange it. She said quietly that she wanted to know who he was, exactly. He stood in the yard and looked at her, looking at him. And the brown coat was suddenly very present, the borrowed name suddenly very loud. And he said, without looking away from the gray eyes that were asking a real question, that he was the man who was grateful she had checked the pipe before the frost. She did not press him. She looked at the folded letter, and then at the hills, and then back at him. And she said she would not refuse the help, if it was genuinely offered. He said it was genuinely offered. She said thank you, in a tone that was, for the first time, not merely civil. The visit to York was arranged. He told himself it was an estate matter, the welfare of the estate's nurse, a practical concern. He told himself this without fully believing it. She was gone for 6 days. In those 6 days, he finished the boundary inspections and wrote the full report he had been composing since the first week, and revised the tenant repair schedule and arranged for a second well to be surveyed, and did not, in any of this activity, stop being aware that the Dower House yard was empty. She came back on a Thursday in the early afternoon, and he was in the east field when the cart came up the lane, and he did not go to the yard, because there was no practical reason for a land steward to be at the yard when the nurse returned. He stayed in the field. She found him there. She came across the field with her plain coat and her basket, and she said that her sister was better than the letter had suggested, that the journey had been worthwhile, and that she was grateful. He said he was glad the sister was improved. She stood in the field and looked at him, and said that the house was talking. He said he was not surprised. She said they were saying he knew too much about the estate to be a steward who had arrived 6 weeks ago. She said that Mrs. Cook said he walked the south boundary like a man counting something that belonged to him. He said nothing. She said quietly that she thought he should tell her who he was. He looked at her in the thin November light, in the east field of the estate that had been his father's and his grandfather's, and he said that he was Gideon Ashvale, that the estate was his, that he had come in a borrowed name because he had found, over 6 years, that he could not see the real thing when people knew who he was. The silence that followed was specific. It was not the silence of shock, entirely, or the silence of anger, entirely. It had in it the particular quality of a woman reordering information she had believed she understood. She said that he was the Marquess of Ashvale. He said yes. She looked at the basket in her hands. She looked at the field. She said very quietly that she had corrected his drainage. He said she had been right about the drainage. She said she had told him to arrange the wood, as though he were a workman. He said the wood had been arranged. She looked at him then, and the gray eyes had in them something that was not the professional assessment, and was not the measuring boundary-drawing quality. It was something he had not seen in them before, something that had heat in it, and uncertainty in equal measure. She said that had been a deception, my lord. He said it had. She said she did not know what to do with that. He said he would not ask her to do anything with it. He had told her because she had asked, and because she deserved to know, and because he found he could not continue in the borrowed name without it being a wrong thing rather than a necessary one. She said nothing for a moment. The field was quiet. The far boundary was visible in the pale light, the trench running correctly now, the outlet 15 feet east of where he had first placed it. She asked why it was a wrong thing now rather than a necessary one. He said because he valued her opinion of him. And he could not value her opinion of Mr. Hale and pretend it was the same thing. She was quiet again. She looked at the field for a long time. Then she said, carefully, that she thought she should go back to the house. He said, of course. She walked back across the field. He watched her go. He did not go to London in the second week of November. He sent a letter to the Dowager explaining that estate business required his continued presence, which produced a response of considerable warmth that managed, in the space of 2 paragraphs, to express both injury and resolution. The resolution being that the Dowager would come to Thornhaven herself with Lady Harrogate and her daughter, which would accomplish the same purpose and allow her to see what had kept him in Shropshire. The Dowager arrived on a grey Tuesday afternoon in a carriage that was markedly finer than anything Thornhaven's Lane was accustomed to. She came with her maid, with Lady Harrogate, and with Miss Arabella Harrogate, who was 23, and possessed of a distinguished manner and the careful animation of a woman who has been told what effect to produce and has been producing it reliably since her debut. Cecily Fenn was in the great house drawing-room when the carriages arrived, having come to speak to the housekeeper about the Hatch family's final week of recovery requirements. She was not supposed to be there. She was there because the housekeeper had asked her to come at 3 o'clock, and the carriages had arrived at 3 o'clock. And there was nothing to be done about the timing. He watched her see the carriages from the window and understand, in a single movement of her face, that she was in the wrong room at the wrong moment, and that retreat was no longer simple. The Dowager came in first. She was 61, and carried her age the way she carried everything, as a credential. She saw her nephew, whom she had not seen in 6 weeks. She saw the room. She saw Cecily Fenn at the far end of it, in a plain dress and a working woman's composure. And her eyes moved across Cecily Fenn with the particular calculation of a woman taking a social inventory. She asked, in a voice that was technically pleasant, who this person was. Gideon said that this was Miss Fenn, who nursed the estate's sick. The Dowager said, with a thin pleasantness, that she was certain the nurse had other business. Miss Harrogate said, to Lady Harrogate, in a voice pitched to Carrie without appearing to intend it, that there was a nurse, Mamma, in the drawing-room. Lady Harrogate said nothing. Cecily Fenn said nothing. She stood at the far end of the room with the basket and the working woman's composure, and she did not look at him. He looked at his aunt. He looked at Miss Harrogate, who had rearranged her expression into something careful and politely blank. He looked at Cecily Fenn, who was looking at the floor now, at the basket in her hands, at the space between herself and the door that was not quite far enough. He said, clearly and without hurry, that Miss Fenn had completed her business with the housekeeper and might stay or go as she wished. She was not dismissed. The Dowager's fan stopped moving. Miss Harrogate's expression altered in a way that was very slight and very precise. Cecily Fenn looked up. He said, in a voice that was level and addressed to the room and to no one in the room except the woman at the far end of it, that Miss Fenn had spent 6 weeks ensuring that this estate's people were properly attended, that she had corrected a drainage error that would have flooded the lower field, that she had identified a failing pipe before the hard frost. She was not a woman to be moved out of a room because other women had arrived in carriages. The Dowager said his name. He said that he had a particular regard for Miss Fenn. The room was very quiet. Outside, the carriages could be heard settling. The fire was the only sound inside. Miss Harrogate looked at the middle distance with an expression that had now achieved a complete blankness. The blankness of a woman revising her understanding of the situation. The Dowager said, after a moment, in a voice that was several degrees cooler than pleasant, that she saw. He said to Cecily Fenn that she need not hurry on account of the arrival. She looked at him. The gray eyes were doing the thing they did when she was deciding about risk. She was deciding now, plainly, in front of his aunt and Lady Harrogate, and Miss Harrogate, and the housekeeper who had appeared at the door, whether to receive what he had said for what it was. She said quietly, "Thank you, my lord." 2 words. The same words she had used before. The tone was entirely different. The dinner that followed was, on the surface, a conventional affair. The dowager recovered her composure with the efficiency of a woman who has survived 40 years of society and knows that composure is the primary weapon. She was gracious to Miss Harrogate. She was gracious to Lady Harrogate. She was gracious to her nephew in the way of a woman who intends to speak to him privately at the earliest opportunity. The earliest opportunity came after dinner, when the ladies had withdrawn, and he sat with a glass of port he was not drinking, and waited for what she would say. She asked, without ceremony, about the nurse. He said yes. She said he was choosing a nurse, Gideon. He said she had told him he was wrong about the drainage. The dowager looked at him. He said she had told him what the pipe would do before the frost. She had told him what the well water was doing to the families in the North Lane. She had sat with the dying and the sick, and managed the things the physician did not manage, and had not, in 6 weeks, looked at him as though he were anything other than a man with a question worth answering. The dowager said she had not known he was the Marquess of Ashval. He said no, and when she had found out, she had told him it was a deception. The dowager said, with a quality of attention he recognized as her genuine self, rather than her social self, that the woman had told him it was a deception. He said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the port she was also not drinking. She asked if Miss Fenn knew what he felt. He said he had told her he had a particular regard for her. He had not said more than that. She said there was the question of her position. He said yes. She said there was the question of what the season would say. He said yes. She said there was the question of Lady Harrogate. He said he had written to her about Lady Harrogate in October. The dowager looked at him for a long moment, with the specific expression she had worn when he was 12 years old and had done something she found both foolish and inevitable. She said he would do as he chose. He had always done as he chose. She asked only that he be certain. He said he had spent 11 years being seen as a title, and 6 weeks being seen as a man, and he knew which he preferred. The dowager said nothing more about it that evening. In the morning, after the carriages had been prepared and the Harrogates were making their courteous departure, he found Cecily Fenn in the Dower House yard. She was tending to the Hatch youngest, a boy of 4 who had been moved to convalescence in the Dower House garden and who was sitting in the weak November sun with a rug on his lap, looking at a leaf he had found with the absorbed interest of a child who is feeling better. He stood at the gate and looked at the yard, the plain coat, the ordinary morning work, the child with the leaf, the woman who had said something to the child that made him laugh, a small, thin sound in the cold air. He said her name. She looked up. She did not look like a woman who had been waiting for him, and she did not look like a woman who had not been. He said he believed he owed her an explanation of what had been said in the drawing room the previous day. She said he owed her nothing. My lord? He said he disagreed. She looked at the child for a moment. She looked at the gate. She said he should come in then. He came through the gate. He stood in the yard at a proper distance. The child looked at him with the mild interest of a child who has been told to rest and finds a visitor an acceptable distraction. He said he had spoken in the drawing room without asking whether it was welcome. which was not a thing he had the right to do. She said he had not done her a harm. He said he may have made her position more complicated. She said her position had been complicated before yesterday, my lord. She was a nurse. She had corrected a land steward's assessment of the drainage on the first occasion without being asked. He said she had been right about the drainage. She said, with the quality that was not quite a smile, and yet was not its absence, that she knew. He looked at her. The November light was thin and honest, and showed the composed face and the gray eyes, and the mark of cold on her cheeks, and the steadiness that had been in her from the first moment he had seen her crossing the yard. He said he would like, if she were willing, to speak plainly. She said she was generally in favor of plain speaking. He said he had come to Thornhaven in a borrowed name because he had wished to see the estate as it truly was. He had not expected to find, in the course of seeing the estate, a person he could not stop thinking about. He had not expected that the person would be the woman who had told him the drainage was wrong. But she was, and she is, and he was a man of sufficient honesty to say so, even if he could not say it with any particular elegance. She was quiet. The child was still looking at the leaf. She said he was a Marquess, my lord. He said he was aware. She said she was a nurse. She was the daughter of a failed farm. She had no connections, no fortune, no family name that signified anything in his world. He said that in the world he had been living in for the last 6 weeks, the connection that signified was the one that kept a child from dying of a fever and identified a failing pipe before the frost. She said that was not how the world he would return to operated. He said he was aware of that also. She said nothing for a moment. He said he was not asking her for an answer to anything today. He was asking only whether she was willing, if he remained at Thornhaven for some time yet, to allow him to know her better. She looked at the child. She looked at the gate. She looked at him. She said she was willing for him to know her better, my lord. She was not willing to be known better by the Marquess of Ashvale. If the Marquess of Ashvale was a different man than the one who had told her he was grateful she had checked the pipe, he said he was not a different man. She said then he might stay at Thornhaven as long as he wished. The dowager left without the outcome she had arrived for. She wrote a letter from her carriage, which he received 3 days later, which said that she had spoken with Lady Harrowgate, and that the matter of Miss Harrowgate was quietly resolved, which was the dowager's way of saying that she had managed the thing so that no one needed to know there had been a thing to manage. She also wrote, in a postscript that was the most honest part of the letter, that Miss Fenn had corrected his drainage, and that she had always thought a woman who corrected a man's drainage was worth some consideration. He read the postscript twice, and thought of his aunt with a warmth he did not always feel. The weeks that followed were plain and accumulative, and finer than any weeks he could recently recall. He stayed in the brown coat because the brown coat was honest. He arranged the repairs that had been waiting and surveyed the second well and wrote to London about the North Lane's water supply and what would replace it. He also, in the afternoons when the light held, found his way to the Dower House yard, and sometimes she was there, and sometimes she was not, and when she was there, they talked. Not always about the estate. Not always about practical things. Sometimes about her sister in York, and sometimes about the farm in Derbyshire, and sometimes about nothing that would have made sense to anyone listening, except that it made sense to them. He told her, on an afternoon in late November, with the first real cold of winter arriving, about the woman he had been engaged to at 22, and the particular loneliness of understanding that what had been loved was the title. She listened without filling the silence. She said, after a time, that she thought it was a difficult thing to be known only for a part of yourself. He said she knew the whole, She looked at him. The gray eyes had something in them that was not the professional assessment, and was not the measuring, boundary-drawing quality, and was not the deciding about risk quality. It was something warmer and plainer than all of those. She said she knew the man who had admitted he was wrong about the drainage. He said that was a fair accounting. She said it was the accounting she preferred. He looked at the yard, at the gate, at the child who had been moved inside 2 weeks ago and recovered, at the field beyond, the corrected trench, the outlet in the right place, at the woman before him in the plain coat, with the gray eyes and the composed face, and the quality of attention that checked for what had not yet gone wrong. He said her name. He said Cecily. The given name, deliberate, unmistakable, the first time it had lived in his voice. She was still. He said he was asking whether she would be willing to let this become something permanent. He was asking without elegance and without certainty of her answer, and with the full knowledge that the world he was asking her to enter was not without its complications. He was asking because 6 weeks of plain speaking and correct drainage was, he found, more than he wished to lose. She was quiet. The cold was sharp and honest around them. The last of the afternoon light was going from the hills. She said, repeating the words back slowly. 6 weeks of plain speaking and correct drainage. He said, and 1 visit to York. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice that was not merely civil, not the working voice, not the professional voice, but something underneath all of those voices that had been there from the beginning, waiting for the right question, that yes, she believed she would be willing. He did not move for a breath. Then he took her hand, the gloved hand, and held it. And the cold was all around them, and neither of them spoke. And it was enough. By Christmas, the banns had been read in the Thornhaven church before a congregation that included the dowager, who had come from London with a settled expression and a very fine shawl she presented to Cecily, with the air of a woman closing a transaction she had not expected to admire. Lady Harrogate heard the news through a mutual connection, and was heard to say, at a dinner in February, that the Marquess of Ashvale had married his nurse, which was the version of events the season circulated. The season did not know about the drainage. The season did not know about the pipe in the North Lane, or the shared well, or the Hatch children, or the 6 weeks in the brown coat. He did not mind what the season did not know. On a morning in February, in the drawing room at Thornhaven, with the fire high and the frost still on the glass, she sat at the small desk she had taken as her own, and wrote to her sister in York. And he sat across the room with the estate accounts, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the particular kind of silence that belongs to 2 people who have nothing to prove to each other, which is the finest kind of silence there is. He looked up from the accounts and found her looking at him, not with the measuring quality, but with something quieter, the something that had been in her eyes on the afternoon in the field when he had told her who he was, and she had received the information, and held it, and chosen to receive him along with it. She said he still owed her an apology, in fact, for the drainage. He said she had told him he was wrong about the drainage. He had admitted it immediately. She said he had not thanked her immediately. He said he was thanking her now. She looked at the window, at the frost on the glass, and then back at him, and the thing in her eyes resolved into a quiet and genuine warmth, the warmth of a woman who has been seen and knows it, and intends to be glad of it. He returned to the accounts. Outside, the winter held the hills in its cold hands, and the lower field lay still under its frost, and the outlet ran exactly where she had told him it should run, 15 feet east, following the natural slope of the land, going where water wished to go without argument. If you stayed until the end of this one, leave a word below. We will be back before long.